Good morning, Dr. R. Michael Fisher. There's a lot of things I've been thinking about in this corona pandemic quarantine time. And now we're in the phase of, after a couple months of lockdown, and for most of us, starting to think about, okay, how do I make sense of the world? How do I get back to normal? Should I be afraid? Should I not be afraid of the future? I'm thinking about a lot of things and hearing conversations, reading articles as I do, or watching interviews, various motivational speakers. And there's a lot of different kinds of performances going on. There's the dark performances of people teaching, wanting to basically try to give us the truth, tell the truth. And then there's a whole bunch of people, of course, seeking that. Yes, what is the truth? What is the truth? What is the conspiracy going on behind the pandemic and the lockdown and the ways of this is our final control. It's our nightmare of 1984, George Orwell's future. And then there's, the positivists of all kinds. We can learn from this. Mother Nature has given us a lesson to go to our room and sit down and be quiet and pause. And there's videos being created, art being created. And this is a great time of opportunity in this crisis. I listen to all these different kinds of branches, but those are the two main branches, aren't they, really? It's the kind of discussion you have potentially with your lover, your friends, your parents, your children, if you have, or relatives. With young people, depends on whatever your walk of life is, whether you're a doctor, a nurse, or a psychologist, or a lawyer, or someone who goes to work every day building a building up on the 34th floor, working with a crew of people. Are we optimistic about the future? Are we pessimistic about the future? And the haunting philosophical question really is what I want to talk about today. From a fearological point of view, from a path of fearlessness point of view. Is it optimism or pessimism that is really the question? So let me just first talk about my experience in this time, and was very similar to SARS a little bit when that pandemic hit, but more so post 9/11, after the terrorist attack in the United States. And then I could go back to the Y2K phenomenon, the turn of the millennium, and I could go back to Bowling for Columbine. And then if you kept going, so that's kind of in my life paying attention to what I call cultural traumas, large scale. But you could go back further, obviously, right, to the Holocaust. You could go back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing and World War II and so on. These horrific events, although, obviously humans have not always experienced those traumatic events in the same way exactly. And the cultural situation and the politics of the times influence how we interpret and read and intake and or even heal possibly those cultural traumas. Life is precarious, that's no doubt. And, quote, shit happens. So let me come back to now the optimism, pessimism debate. And I think it's playing in people's minds. I think there's an inner conflict in our brains going back and forth on those two. Should I be optimistic? Should I be positive? And then you get a lot of very rational people who say, well, I'm optimistic, positive, and I'm negative as well. Or I'm realistically optimistic something I've often said. Well, one of the things on the darker side, let's start there, and then I'll address the positivists in the next half of the video. Let's just call them the negativists for now. And these include things, people who are very serious thinkers, very researchers, academics even, and of course a lot within the populist. And they're attempting to educate people to not be too positive. I think that's maybe the universal message of the negativist. Don't be too positive because, quote, shit happens, and not only shit happens, the world from many indicators is probably going downhill. Eventual spiral, collapse of civilizations, various kinds of, on top of that, conspiracy theorists about very systematic attempts of some groups of people in the world to actually pull down the world and keep themselves alive. The survivorists, the elite, the rich, the powerful, and that they are even colluding to reduce the human population so that they can actually survive longer and have control of all the resources. And then there's, obviously those kinds of narratives, right? Those teaching stories of the negativists are around because there's a whole lot of people. It's probably more than half of the population by far wants to hear those stories and feeds those kinds of people that create and make those stories. And in their way, they are telling the truth that they will often say that you don't really want to hear, but you have to hear it. This is the lesson of it. Warning, 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 caution, caution, caution. Breeds a lot of fear, but they're going to be tough. The truthers, the theorists, the negativists, because this is real, is what they argue. And so they're going to be tough, what I call the rugged toughness of the truther, reality maker, prophet of the dark news. Now, they may have a little optimism, hope about the future, but typically that's not their teaching. So you're going to hear a lot of that. Could come from your neighbor, could come from your teenager, could come from anyone. And there's a lot out there. So I've been hearing, for example, a person who's very well educated and has shared with me antinatalist philosophy, which is a bit of a story. Not that I'm an expert on antinatalism as a philosophy, but it's been around for a while and it's appearing more and more these days of wouldn't the world, this is my understanding and take on it on the surface, wouldn't the world be better off without our species? And hasn't, quote, Mother Nature itself, creation itself, pretty much said and shown the earth and its ecosystems, its beautiful life, would be better off without this species, which we are basically a failed species. We've proven it, and evolution will wipe us off, and nature will do that. And if it's a virus like COVID-19 or some other form of weather disasters to the point of heating up the planet because of the excess pollution that humans have put into the world for a long time, that will eventually take us all down, and many other species going down with us, but eventually lots of species will be left, perhaps bacteria and viruses only, but life will be remained and humans will be gone and more life will come and evolve, and the planet will be a post-human planet. That is actually an ethical philosophy, well thought out, by the way. I have no doubt. There's a lot to it. I've often thought of that. If humans, let's just take me as a philosopher, ethical concern, moral philosopher, if you will, and anyone who believes in a moral way of being in the world, which I happen to label the path of fearlessness as that way. But regardless of that, moral choice, moral decision-making, moral thinking would tell me that, yeah, you're right, antinatalists. Some might call it anti-humanists, or post-humanism is another philosophy that carries some of this thinking as well. It is that, yeah, you say that we care about suffering and we want to love and care, take care of, and that we are a species that is ethical, rational, and so on. We are made, if you want to use religious language, in the image of Yahweh, God, Spirit. If we really care about suffering and reducing suffering, very principles of the Buddha, we would actually be on a mission. And I'm talking about an intelligent, rational, planned, systematic mission to erase human species from this planet. Because of the way it is now, not 90% of our history plus, but now, in contemporary, modern, technological society, we have carried on in an unethical way. So let's make the universal ethical judgment, as one would make in a good courtroom of the highest ideal, principles, religious and spiritual principles if you want to add to that. But just for the moment, even just rationally, yeah, the world would be better off without most humans. So let's make that happen. And we'll start with, this is my idea for the people who have this philosophy, the negativists' philosophy. And they also come out of the ecological movement, Earth First movement, etc. And some of the real radical ecological philosophers and activists say the same thing. Let's get rid of a whole lot of humans. And of course, the way we've carried on in our lifestyles, especially in the first world, so-called advanced world, so-called developed world, so-called, let's get rid of, that very major negative impact on the planet in terms of ecological, in terms of ethical basis. So they are, as a whole, speaking a lot of truth, in my estimation, as I've been studying, for 50 years at least, since I was a teenager, late years in high school, that, yeah, this is a effed up situation, and humans are the drivers of that effed up human situation. And over 50 years of thinking about that and studying it very carefully, and the motivations of humans that seem to carry on as primary and have dissed other, let's call them, better parts of our nature, even angel nature, as some people might say, that we have carried on, and we are now the cause of massive suffering. So that's the ethical basis, isn't it? Really, the suffering has continued and is, severe, severe, severe in general, massively, but obviously there's better parts of our nature, again, showing up at different times in different ways, obviously. The mother who takes care of her child down the block that I watch how she treats her child and so on, and I see, real great mothering and parenting going on. But that's just one example, right? So we know there's more than that going on. That's not the debate. It's the philosophical debate that we have to consider, and it's coming at us to consider from these different directions. And I'm talking about the negativist direction. So yeah, it would be ethical to remove massive amounts of humans from the planet to basically make a planet healthy, sane, and sustainable, so-called, for the future of at least some remaining humans, and for a whole lot of other species of very valuable importance to the whole ecological system, which humans depend on. And sometimes one of the reasons that we see wiping out these humans in this post-human view, I'm summarizing here, is that most humans do not abide by the laws of nature and actually refuse to, and believe that they will be superior to the end, and there is actually even no end because they'll figure out some way to prolong the end and or go to another planet, start another civilization there that they can be superior and lead in. So you see the narrative of the negativist view of this human imaginary, and one can say human with quote marks because it's almost a barbaric imaginary of domination that hardly even deserves the word human. That's kind of the negativist's point, I think, isn't it? You get right down to it. And I've basically argued, yeah, I can see that view. I can actually entertain that view and see it as worthy of actually being heard by humans today. And then I think, okay, but everything I've just said in this video, this is where I'm kind of coming to as I make my own ethical judgments about that narrative. Let's just call it post-human negativists for now. The world is going down hell in a handbasket kind of understanding. Can you have that conversation? Can I want to show this video to my grandson, 10 years old? Would I show this video to the mother down the street who's just got a 3-month-old baby that she's now carrying around on her breast, walking out into the world, getting her exercise in this pandemic time, more or less thinking about the future, and more or less trying not to think about the future negatively too much, because if she did, and if this 10-year-old thought about the negativist viewpoint too long, arguably just from a mental health perspective, it'd be questionable whether that'd be a good thing to do or not. It'd be actually seen as misanthropic, self-demeaning of one's human speciesness, even though we're more than human, we're interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh might say as a Buddhist monk. But regardless, just the real practicality of how much of that narrative, how much of that so-called truthing reality, conspiracy reality, whatever it is, do they want and is good for them? How does a 10-year-old make that decision? And really, how do I make that decision? How does a mother down the street with the child on her breast make that decision? Those are just a few examples. So I'm kind of making a philosophical position here that, okay, if you want to have those constructed narratives of the truth in the negativist viewpoint, worthy of consideration, because it'll certainly wake us up more or less if we want to look at that material of how we're fucking up as a species in relationship to nature and how this world functions under natural laws. How much truth is good for them? And as a philosopher, I have to ask that. So that's kind of my point on the negative side here. And I'm kind of saying this to all the negativists of all various kinds, not disrespectfully at all, but Do I want to say what I've just said on this video? Do I want to even reproduce and say and write about these negativist views, comment on them, or even perpetuate them, and say that to the face of a real person in the form of a 10-year-old, a mother with a child on her breast? That's the ethical challenge I think we're in today, and philosophically and ethically. I have to look holistically. So I often actually say this kind of consideration I'm making right now, arguably, is that it's a non-fear-based designation of a way for me to behave in the face of fellow creatures. And I'm emphasizing the 10-year-old because of the stakes that they have. Not someone like me, 68 years old. My stakes are very different. Or the mother and the child on her breast. So I repeat those as metaphors, not just as people, persons, situations. So they're kind of articulating metaphors of a correction to my ability to, as a thinker, adult, philosopher, to be pretty even snarky and arrogant about my great understanding and my investigations into the future. And I think this is where futurology and futurists thinking, futures education, has to entertain these discussions about the truth, right? Where we're going as a species. I'm just taking the negativist side. And yet we have to include, that's my point here, education, and then I'll move to the positivists, is we have to include the mother and the child, the 10-year-old. So think about that, okay? All you real smart people who know so much and get so many hits on your videos and interviews and so on. Are you considering the reference that I've just offered today? And the reason I'm using that reference is I would argue, and I'm not going to argue in this video per se, that would be a much longer argument, is I've given a non-fear-based understanding or view of the negativist narrative. Okay, so that may be a useful direction for us to go in the future, and for even individuals who are not philosophers per se to think about. What kind of conversations do I have in my head and in public and that I spread on the planet, like memes, stories, attitudes? Are they fit? Are they good fit? Are they beautiful fit for the life of a 10-year-old, the life of a mother with a child on her breast? And yeah, across all cultural, environmental, geographic, and historical references, realities. Much more complicated when you give that internationalist global perspective, but if you don't want to start there, start with just your neighborhood and the 10-year-old and the mother, etc. All right, now to the positivists. My basic underlying path of fearlessness narrative that I've been creating for 31 years. Interesting and difficult challenge to do so, because I have to learn to think outside, critically think outside, but also empathetically and compassionately think outside the norms, right? The narratives of that really powerful, pessimistic, misanthropic side. And now to the positivist side, which is, the better angels of our nature, that human nature is actually fundamentally good. We're made in the image of God, and so on and so on. And if we just heal enough and transform enough and will ourself enough and develop and educate ourselves in character, to our good nature, There's lots to look forward to, even narratives within the positivist side of, because humans are great and we are the greatest species that's ever been here. We have the biggest brain. We have the most intelligent technological computer systems now, AI, which will help us through this mess. So we're going to focus on the positive side. Well, we can give that. We'll tell that to the 10-year-old. We'll tell that to the mother with the child at her breast, if you want to use those references again. Positivists more easily will want that truth delivered systematically and put into our educational systems and our therapy rooms and our doctor's offices and so on. But of course, the reality is, just take the doctor. They can't be positive about everything if it's not real. Oh, you have stage 4 cancer, actually. Sorry, no, I can't really be that positive about it. Your chances of survival are point percent and so on. That's an interesting reference because at a cultural level, right, at a futures level, we can also play doctor, and then, right, we want to be positive like a doctor. Almost the white coat itself is a sign of being positive. Same if you put on the minister's collar in the church, delivering a positive message. That's why people go. They go to you, but they also want the truth, so, to a certain degree. Not as far as the pessimists or the dark negativist view of the truth. They only want more than half of the truth of the good side. Teaspoonful or more of the negativist side, and we'll take the bucket full of the positive side, and that's what we'll try to live by, and that makes us seem to feel better and have hope. Yeah, that's the primary condition of the positivist side, is hope, optimism, right? Various social biologists have debated that and said, well, our species actually requires it, and not only that, we're hardwired for hope. Won't go into those conversations, dialogues. I've looked at both sides, the positivists and the negativists, quite equally. Probably spend more of my time in my life on the negativist narratives. And I don't think either one of those is a bad choice that I've made. I don't regret that. And I think what you're seeing me circling around to right now in this conversation I'm having is, I'm not a negativist or a positivist in that sense. I'm an integralist. So I kind of believe the positivist upside of things and the negativist downside of things, shadow side, if you will, the light and the dark, the yin and the yang, kind of metaphoric, dialectic view of reality is what I use. Sometimes love, positive, fear, negative, if you will. Not that I see it in that total way, but that's an interesting narrative. And in the middle is the path of fearlessness, where those join, the coming down and the going up. Fearlessness is always mediating that. So philosophy of fearlessness, or psychology of fearlessness psychology, which I've written about a lot and talked about a lot. If you want to know more, I'd be glad to share more on that, or you can certainly read much of my work that's online, available free. That fearlessness is always mediating the going up and the going down, so that you don't get over positivism, kind of hyperinflated notion of ourself and our greatness and our species, the superior intelligence and so on. And mediating the negative coming down is that you don't get misanthropic and think that we're, a horrible, evil, insensitive species and so on. Fearlessness chews up and says more or less to the positivist drive, the negativist drive, eros, thanatos, as Freud might argue. It's much more complex than I'm making it out here to be. Ascenders and descenders, to use Plotinus's philosophy and so on. And Wilber's interpretation of that philosophy as an integralist philosopher. So I really am integrating many views, including an indigenous worldview, including a feminist matrixial worldview, and so on. This is the much more complex part to my fearlessness psychology that I'm promoting right now, and that I have for many, many decades, is that both the ascender inflation and the descender deflation attempts to the truth, to truthing, to think about those from a fearlessness perspective. And what that does, real basically, in my view, from my understanding of the fearlessness traditions of the world, which I've studied very carefully, of course, never adequately, there's more to be learned. They are articulating a perspective, these fearlessness teachings, that both the optimist ascender inflation, negativist deflation, descent views on reality, both have some truths, but each in and of themselves are not adequate to the whole truth. And that whole truth, it goes beyond what we can even know, probably, and quite likely is just mystery. The universe is that complex. These systems of metaphysical realities as well as just physical realities. The material world is, we don't understand everything about it and probably never will. But we have to live day to day and make choices based on the best truths we know, right? So that's the challenge. So I'm just saying the fearlessness perspective here, path of fearlessness as a way to walk into the world, doesn't rely on the optimists and doesn't rely on the pessimists. It's simple as that. Just don't rely on them. And the reason is they have a tendency to each become opposites, polarities, right? And try to move against each other and fight and battle. And that's part of the existence. That's part of the way discourses, narratives, stories, they are competing for the truth, for the way to advance a particular view. And that, in its worst, becomes ideology. The fearlessness perspective, this philosophy I'm speaking about today, which ought to be taught to a 10-year-old, to a mother with a child at the breast, without breeding fear. Because once you have put all your eggs in a basket of hope, there's always the fear curdling underneath at this other force, which we know is real. There's some truth to it. I've said you're going to go down eventually, and it may not be pretty, and it may be sooner than you think. And that could be as an entire species, as a living planet. Complete transformation of what we've known as normal and real. Fearlessness perspective just doesn't buy into the fear base of that half dominating or that half dominating. And in the fearlessness perspective, it says it's not either or anyway. Yeah, those views will be in contested conflict. Fearlessness says that's not our problem. Fearlessness perspective just says I wouldn't rely on either one alone. And I don't need to try to decide on one or the other as the truth and the best truth for myself in my life, and to tell to a 10-year-old, to talk to with a 10-year-old, and to talk to with a mother with a child at the breast, not telling them, to talk to them. And then there's another interesting part, and I'll end the video on this part, is in those narratives of the positive, which you're seeing lots today flooding out there, and lots flooding in the other direction to the disaster, tragedy. There's a common pattern I've detected, maybe you have too. It's not that I have magical insights to these things. I'm very systematic in studying them, how we talk as a species, how we talk as a group, as individuals, as teachers, as motivational speakers, whatever it is. I'm very aware that the universal of both of those narratives generally is don't be afraid. Fear not. Be not afraid. Don't let fear control you. So let's go with the negativists first, because I started there in the video. They're basically saying this is the truth, this is a reality, but yeah, you should be afraid of that, they might start to say, but they're basically demonstrating in their honesty, their truth, their capacity as rational assessors, critical analysis, that there's no use being afraid of it, is what they're basically is their message. So they say it, don't be afraid, because that won't be actually helpful to you being able to adapt or even cope with and handle the decline that's going on, the fall of the empire, without pretty much becoming a mental health case, psychotic breakdown, or living in absolute neurotic paranoia, which isn't really a lot of fun. They'll still say, don't be afraid. And at a certain level, don't be afraid of the truth is one way they like to put it, the negativists. Okay, fine. The positivists will, of course, say, don't be afraid of the truth and don't listen to those negativist guys, because their truth is false prophecy and so on and so on. Or it's just not healthy for you, partly true. And so they will say, don't be afraid of being of your greatness, don't be afraid to hope, to have faith. And that's right from the secular community to the spiritual communities, religious communities, and so on, and the leadership of those communities. So lots of interesting dynamic there, because they're both saying, don't be afraid. Don't let fear control you. There's a way out, right? So they'll say, let love, on the positivist side, let love dominate over fear. And the negative side, they'll just say, let truth, rational capacity, and moral, ethical imperative dominate over their fear. And that will be generally good for us. And so, in concluding, a fearlessness perspective, right? Mediating between those two competing discourses for the future, if you will, kind of competing for the future. What else is new? Probably been going on throughout the entire part of human history almost. I'm speculating on that, right? Of course, has been somewhat of an interplay of this dynamic, this dialectic, this oppositional potential. But my point of the fearlessness perspective in mediating is, well, then it makes sense to me if both of them have this, don't fear, shouldn't fear, which I actually think is actually quite anti-educative. It's more a propaganda that's being promoted in that directive to not fear. Whether I fear something or don't fear something is not the point from a fearlessness perspective. It's not even the issue of contention. It's what, in a fearlessness perspective, I'm working to integrate the knowledge and the experience, the emotional feeling level, right up to the highest levels of thought, post-rational, even non-dual, spiritual thinking, if you want. All of those levels, full spectrum of my being, is not whether I should be afraid or not. be afraid and follow this imperative of fear not. No, that's not the fearlessness psychology or philosophy or perspective that I teach and what I see in the greatest traditions of the fearlessness teachings. Rather, the emphasis is on not to be caught up in those discourses, up or down, and see them as dramas of performances of people who are, or institutions, could be a government that's promoting either one of those or whatever, some group or institution even, to not be caught up in their dramas of needing their narratives, of needing their position on that cycling, on that dialectic movement. And ride them. Don't avoid learning in the fearlessness perspective. Learn from and learn from without getting caught in the propaganda of them. And the reason that they're constantly both using and don't be afraid is because they are afraid. And more or less, they're denying the deep existential terror of the possibility of that may not work. That may not work. Going up or down. It may not work. And there's a deep terror underneath losing the truth, being even wrong, failing in your project to maintain that narrative, Okay? Fearlessness perspective. So I don't worry about whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I don't even think about it much. I do a little bit. I'm now shifting. This is my newest thought of whatever I think about the world philosophically and from all my experience and study and research and my PhD, whatever. I'm thinking about no matter what I say and what I do in terms of a future's perspective, which all humans will consider, is it that it's not fear-based. And that it contains a certain elegance, beauty, if you will. And that I purvey that in some way. And that I purvey that to the 10-year-old in having a discussion about the future. Whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. Well, news reporters, as you know, and people spreading most of the knowledge in media today, including all the elites that can control the power of knowledge for the most part. They're not asking those questions of criteria that I've offered today. And they're not offering a fearlessness perspective, which is one that does not breed more fear unnecessarily, but promotes a path, right, on this alternative route. Includes those perspectives, but if you say, includes and transcends, as an integralist would argue, that's the better way. And I'm not going to turn that into a propaganda and an ideology either, because that can be skewed, that can be fear-based as well, even unconsciously fear-based. I may not feel the fear and recognize it, but it can be unconsciously fear-based. So that's the study, right? That's the program of my training as a warrior of the fearlessness path. Thanks for this today.